We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Orinoco Tribune has a great story entitled, U.S. Says More Drones as a Fed-Up World Shakes Its Head. The U.S. is completely unashamed by the depth and audacity of the evil plans it is revealed to have organized. No matter what you catch them doing, there's zero chance they will take the high road, admit responsibility, and adjust their course. Backing right sector heroes they agreed are terrorists a short while ago? Never happened. Nord Stream bombers? Nah. What are we to make of this? Well, for insight, let's turn to our next guest. He's a writer, journalist, and host of the YouTube program, The New Atlas, Brian Berletic. Brian, welcome to the Critical Hour.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor and a pleasure.
So the Orinoco piece continues now, getting its drones as close to Crimea as they can without getting caught. Oops, is just another setup for a sketch on the mock news of Saturday Night Live. The U.S.-sponsored headline is that Russia is warned to operate military aircraft with caution. Brian, there seems to be no rule, no standard, no law that the United States will not ignore and break and then deny, so long as it furthers its objectives. Brian Berletic.
Well, absolutely. And we have to remember that this entire conflict began because the United States overthrew Ukraine's government in 2014 and pumped the country full of weapons and provided military training. This is what triggered it in the first place. Now they're flying their drones around the conflict, collecting intelligence and passing it on to Ukrainian forces to assist them in carrying out attacks in this armed conflict. So they are a party to the conflict. Those drones are there to threaten Russia, and so Russia is responding. And something else in that article that's very interesting is they mention the air defense identification zone around Taiwan and how American politicians constantly complain about Chinese warplanes violating it, even though they officially recognize Taiwan as part of China. And yet this situation with Ukraine and Russia is so much more serious. And this is the hypocrisy that the U.S. constantly demonstrates.
You know, Brian, what we're seeing now is a number of things come to a head. One of them is the U.S. tries to push that the world is theirs, that they can draw red lines around the Solomon Islands, the red lines in the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea or wherever that they want, but that China or Russia or no other country has any expectation of a sphere of influence. And we're seeing bit by bit these paradigms that the U.S. has tried to hold on to being called into question, and the U.S. doesn't know how to deal with it. Brian.
That's a really good point. And when you really think about what U.S. foreign policy is based on, it's based on might makes right. And that's fine as long as you're the mightiest. But it seems as if the U.S., its military power, is in decline. It is being eclipsed in some ways by both Russia and China. And now when Russia and China have the ability to assert their national security interests, now the United States don't like that notion of might making right.
Even though in the issue with China and what we see to a great degree with Russia, the muscle that is being flexed is economic muscle. Now, I know, of course, that Russia is engaged in Ukraine. I understand that, but that was a defensive move. So when you look at what China is doing, when you look at China is in the Middle East flexing its muscle diplomatically, bringing peace to the region, that's a problem for the United States. China goes to Russia, puts forth a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine. United States dismisses it out of hand. My point is, yes, it's a matter of might makes right, but most folks assume that that's a military convention. In this instance, it's economic.
That's another good point. And I think the advantage that Russia and China actually have is that not only do they have the might in a military sense, a diplomatic sense, an economic sense, but they're also backing it with actual international law. And they're doing it in a very reasonable way that the general public can understand without the need, say, what the US does, mountains of lies to buttress their version of might makes right. So it really is very powerful when you have this might and it is lining up with something that is actually justified and reasonable.
RT reports UK's depleted uranium plan threatens all of Europe. The Ukraine conflict could descend into a fight, quote, to the last European. That's the other thing. The UK is doing this, they're deploying this, but they're doing it in Europe. They're doing it. I mean, here Ukraine is like, yeah, they're defending us. How are you doing? You're polluting our country with uranium dust. Your thoughts on the business about the depleted uranium tipped missiles and rounds?
Don't forget, in terms of pollution, you're talking about methane gas from the bombing and the blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Right.
That's also, yeah. When you want to talk about pollution, that is really important to keep in mind. The depleted uranium rounds are not going to make any sort of actual difference on the battlefield. They have their use, but the drawbacks, the danger of using it's so dangerous. Not only on the battlefield to everyone there, but long after the battle is over, the civilian population that has to pick up and do reconstruction. It's such a malice move for the UK to be sending these. And I can only imagine that they're doing it because their stockpiles are so depleted. They're sending these Challenger tanks there, a small number of them. And this is probably all that they have on hand. That's how bad the state of the UK military is in. But it's still not an excuse to do this. And then we're going to hear all kinds of reasons why this is okay. It's not such a big deal. But I think people are starting to catch on how malice and indifferent the UK and their allies are regarding this conflict.
And so, to that point, talk about the escalatory nature of using depleted uranium rounds. A Russian official has said the next step could be the use of a dirty bomb by the Kiev regime or the deployment of a tactical nuclear weapon. So there is an escalation here. And again, I reiterate, Xi goes to Russia, meets with Putin, puts a 12-point peace plan on the table. Now, we can debate the validity of the peace plan all day long. But that's what negotiations and diplomacy are for. And the United States dismisses it out of hand, and Xi even talks to Zelensky. So there do seem to be roads open here. The United States wants to put barriers on each road.
And the most interesting thing is we continuously hear from Washington that this is about Ukraine's sovereignty and their agency, and they have the final decision. But when this talk about a potential peace plan floated by the Chinese leadership, as soon as it was floated, it was the United States that immediately shot it down, and it had it wasn't as if they consulted with Kiev to do that. And it's just further proof that this is not about fighting for Ukraine's sovereignty. Its sovereignty ended in 2014. The decisions being made for Ukraine's future are being made in Washington. That's what they proved. And this is also proof that this is nothing more than a proxy war being fought by the US against Russia using Ukrainian blood and treasure. And there's no cost for Washington. They pay no price for this. And so they have no incentive to seek peace.
Perfect segue into this. Bakhmut is encircled. All roads in and out of it are under Russian artillery fire. Meanwhile, another city, Avdiivka, seems to be in the process of being encircled and not far from it now. Your thoughts on what's happening on the battlefield and how this affects things?
Well, it is a good segue because we're talking about finishing this conflict on the battlefield and just making it physically impossible for the U.S. to continue this conflict. So we are watching Russia in a very patient and methodical way grind down Ukraine's military in terms of trained manpower and military equipment. We see Bakhmut encircled. We see Adivka now being encircled. These are two major fortified cities along a very major defense line that Ukraine has maintained in the Donbas region for years, before the special military operation even began. And the fact that Russian forces are able to crack these fortifications, encircle these two major defensive positions, it just goes to show how degraded Ukraine's military has become. And at the same time, we see the West running out of weapons and munitions to send to Ukraine. So it's having a cumulative effect. And eventually, under all of this pressure, Ukraine's fighting capacity is going to collapse.
You talk about the United States having difficulty and the allies having difficulty sending weapons. Now the United States, to that point, is talking about stepping up the time frame on delivery of the Abrams tanks. Again, everything the United States does seems to be escalatory, not peace-oriented, and now they're talking about sending more tanks, sending those tanks sooner.
Absolutely, but in terms of politics, yes, it is an escalation, but in reality, on the battlefield, you cannot speed up this type of process. You cannot speed up the training of Ukrainian operators on these tanks. It takes months, if not years, to develop a solid tank crew and then a solid tank unit operating together. These are weapon systems that Ukraine has no experience operating, and they're not going to be able to hop into these tanks and bring them on the battlefield effectively with just a couple of weeks of training. It just doesn't work that way. And the fact that they're speeding this up, it is kind of an escalation, but it also kind of hints at desperation by the United States, because it is so ill-conceived to rush something like this onto the battlefield. We have to kind of wonder why they're doing that.
You know, Brian, it's almost like I'm standing there facing a samurai warrior who is trained from birth with his sword. He sleeps with his sword. He lives. His sword is part of his body. And you walk up to me and say, here, I'm going to give you a sword so you can fight this samurai warrior. It ain't going to do me no good. You can train me a week or two and then say, here, go fight that samurai warrior. My head's going to be cut off in 10 seconds. So the idea to say, go fight these tank commanders over here. Here's a new tank. We'll show you how to point it in the right direction and mash on the gas. You're going to go right over there and get yourself killed. We only got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, again, that is a very good point. And then beyond just operating the tanks, there's all of the logistics that go along with it. So Ukraine is operating a multitude of just main battle tanks alone, and they need different ammunition, spare parts, and all kinds of equipment for each variety. So this creates a logistical nightmare, and most people realize that wars are determined by logistics more than it is about tactics on the battlefield.
Brian Berletic, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Oh, thank you so much.
Folks, you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.